What if a single regional war quietly restarted a global inflation crisis? In 2026, Europe isn't collapsing, but it is tightening under pressure. Prices rise, growth slows, and energy flows shake the system. And this time, the warning signs look dangerously familiar. Chapter 1. A war that rewired energy flows. It starts with sudden chaos in the Middle East, where conflict disrupts one of the world's most important energy routes almost instantly. The Strait of Hormuz becomes a global pressure point, and oil markets react before governments even respond. Ships are delayed, contracts are frozen, and traders begin pricing in risk instead of stability. Europe, heavily dependent on imported energy, feels the shock within days. Electricity prices begin shifting, fuel costs climb, and industries that rely on stable energy inputs are forced to reassess operations. What makes this moment so powerful is how fast uncertainty spreads across global systems. Regional conflict instantly becomes a global economic event. Energy is no longer just a commodity, it has become a geopolitical weapon again. And Europe, even with years of preparation, is reminded that its economic stability is still deeply connected to distant regions where even small disruptions can trigger massive financial consequences almost immediately. Chapter 2. Oil prices reignite inflation fire. Crude oil markets react first, and they react sharply. Prices rise not just because of current disruption, but because of future uncertainty being priced in. Every barrel now carries geopolitical risk, and that risk spreads into every corner of the economy. Europe feels it through transport costs, electricity bills, and industrial production expenses. Factories that depend on stable energy pricing suddenly face unpredictable operating costs. Food supply chains also absorb the pressure as logistics become more expensive due to fuel volatility. Inflation, which had been cooling after earlier global shocks, begins to rise again in a way that feels uncomfortable and familiar. Even economies with strong fiscal systems cannot fully shield consumers from global energy pricing. And here's the key shift. This is not demand-driven inflation anymore. It is supply-driven, meaning traditional policy tools become less effective. Markets begin to behave cautiously, and households start adjusting spending habits earlier than expected. The fire of inflation is not new, but this time it is being reignited by forces far outside domestic control again. Chapter 3. Europe's fragile energy dependency problem. So how did Europe end up vulnerable again, even with years of energy transition planning? The answer lies in a structural dependency that was never fully resolved. Europe has made progress in renewable energy, but it still relies heavily on imported oil and gas to maintain industrial output and economic stability. This means external shocks can still quickly become internal crises. When the global energy supply is disrupted, Europe feels it almost immediately through pricing pressure and supply uncertainty. Countries like Germany, France, and Italy are especially exposed due to their industrial structures. Renewable energy is expanding, but it is not yet strong enough to replace fossil fuel dependency during peak demand or crisis situations. This gap between transition goals and real-world capacity creates ongoing vulnerability. Energy security becomes not just an environmental issue but an economic one. And in moments like this, the weakness becomes visible again, reminding Europe that transformation is still incomplete and deeply dependent on global stability now. Chapter 4. Inflation returns. After the 2022 to 2024 recovery. After years of effort to stabilize inflation following earlier global disruptions, Europe suddenly begins reversing progress. Energy costs feed directly into consumer prices again, and inflation starts rising across multiple sectors simultaneously. Core inflation climbs due to fuel, transport, and production costs increasing together. Central banks are forced back into a difficult position where every policy decision carries risk. Tightening interest rates may control inflation, but risk slowing growth further. Easing policy may support growth, but risk allowing inflation to persist longer. As these pressures build, a deeper concern emerges. What happens when stability begins breaking just after recovery? Businesses start adjusting pricing structures again, while consumers reduce spending to prepare for uncertainty. The recovery that once looked stable now appears fragile. Inflation is no longer just a statistic, returning to daily life in visible ways. And when expectations shift, they reinforce inflation across the system itself in a continuous loop. Chapter 5. Growth slows as businesses cut back. As energy and production costs rise, Europe's economic momentum begins to slow. Manufacturing output weakens, especially in Germany, France, and Italy, where industries depend heavily on stable energy pricing. Companies delay investment decisions, not because demand disappears, but because uncertainty increases. Consumer spending is also weakening as households adjust budgets under higher living costs. This creates a ripple effect across supply chains, where reduced demand leads to lower production, which further slows growth. Financial markets respond by lowering growth expectations across the region. The economy is not collapsing, but it is clearly losing speed. Slowdowns like this are particularly dangerous because they build gradually rather than through sudden shocks. Each cautious decision adds pressure over time. Less investment, slower hiring, reduced spending. Europe's growth engine continues running, but under increasing strain as energy instability continues shaping economic behavior across all sectors in real time. Chapter 6. The stagflation pattern reappears. This is where things become structurally more concerning. Rising prices combined with slowing growth begin forming a pattern that economists recognize immediately: stagflation risk. Unlike a traditional recession where demand falls sharply, this situation is more complex. Prices are rising because of supply constraints, while growth is weakening due to reduced economic activity. It creates a slow economic squeeze that affects almost every sector simultaneously. Energy costs remain the central driver, feeding into transport, manufacturing, and services. Businesses face reduced margins, while consumers face higher living costs, creating pressure on both sides of the economy. The difficulty for policymakers is that standard tools do not work cleanly in this environment. Inflation control can harm growth, while growth support can worsen inflation. And that creates a policy deadlock. So how can an economy stabilize when inflation and slowdown reinforce each other at the same time? This is the exact tension defining Europe's current economic challenge, and it is why stagflation fears are returning now more visibly than before. Chapter 7. Central banks caught in a policy trap. Central banks across Europe now face one of the most difficult balancing acts in recent years. Fighting inflation requires higher interest rates, but higher rates also increase borrowing costs for businesses and households, slowing economic activity further. At the same time, lowering rates could support growth, but risk allowing inflation to persist longer than desired. This creates what economists often call a policy trap, where every decision carries significant trade-offs. Markets become highly sensitive to even small signals from central bank communication, reacting instantly to shifts in tone or expectation. Governments attempt to support vulnerable sectors through fiscal measures, but their capacity is limited after previous economic recovery spending. Meanwhile, uncertainty spreads across financial systems as investors reassess long-term stability. The challenge is not just technical, it is psychological, because when institutions appear uncertain, markets amplify that uncertainty. Europe is now navigating a narrow path where policy mistakes could either deepen inflation or slow growth further, making the situation extremely delicate and closely watched globally. Chapter 8. The new global economic order taking shape. As Europe struggles with energy-linked economic pressure, a broader shift begins forming in the global economy. Energy security has become one of the most important drivers of economic influence. Countries with stable energy production or diversified supply chains gain a strategic advantage, while import-dependent regions face greater vulnerability during geopolitical shocks. Supply chains continue to move away from high-risk zones, accelerating diversification trends that are already underway. This gradually reshapes global trade patterns, influencing where investment flows and industrial expansion occur. Europe remains a major economic power, but its exposure to external energy shocks highlights the need for deeper structural transformation. Meanwhile, regions with stronger energy independence begin gaining leverage in trade negotiations and industrial development. The result is not a sudden shift, but a gradual rebalancing of global economic influence. And in this new environment, resilience matters as much as growth. The 2026 crisis does not redefine the world overnight, but it accelerates a transition that was already quietly underway beneath global markets, now shaping future power structures. This is no longer just a regional shock. Energy, war, and inflation are now tightly connected forces shaping global stability. Understanding these shifts is no longer optional. Stay informed, stay aware, and follow for more in-depth global analysis.